Well, welcome to today's April webinar with West Bend Mutual Insurance. My name's Joe Wimmer with the West Bend Loss Control Team, and today I have the privilege of spending the next hour or so discussing an employer's approach to distracted driving with you. Please note today's webinar is not intended to be an employee education or employee training, but rather this is intended to be an employer's approach to looking at distracted driving and means to control the costs of losses to distracted driving within your fleet operations, and of course, controlling our largest asset to us, which is our employees. So our agenda today, we're going to be looking at defining distracted driving and looking at the different types of distractions, as well as behaviors and sources of distraction that we see behind the wheel. We're going to look at the costs of distracted driving within your fleet operations and or potential costs that we see with distracted driving. We're going to dive into state, federal laws, regulations, and recommendations related to distracted driving. And then we'll finish it up discussing how to structure or assess your current distracted driving plans, look at how to implement that, and then also discuss some advancements in distracted driving detection. So first and foremost, let's dive into what is distracted driving. Distracted driving is defined as completing a secondary task that diverts or captures attention away from the task of driving. While that seems pretty straightforward, there are a few components that really do make up distracted driving. And the first component I really want to look at is the different types of distractions that we see. So we know that distraction is anything that removes our attention as drivers away from the task of driving. There's two different types of distractions, though. There's conscious distractions and unconscious distractions. A conscious distraction is one that is willing. We know we're doing that, such as grabbing that cell phone next to us, tuning the radio, looking at a GPS system or informatics system in the vehicle. An unconscious distraction is one that's not willing. It could be a wandering mind, an impairment, or being fatigued. Within these types of distractions, we have four main types of distractions that we commonly see behind the wheel. The first being cognitive distraction, followed by auditory distraction, then visual distraction, and lastly, manual distraction. And we're going to take a few minutes here to discuss each one of these different types of distractions so we understand them better. So cognitive distraction is when a driver's mind is not focused on driving. We're preoccupied with personal work-related issues, could consider it daydreaming or thinking of something else other than the task of driving itself. Auditory distraction is a noise that prevents a driver's attention from the task of driving. We see this a lot when drivers listen to an in-depth podcast, listening to music, active listening, whether it's to a passenger within the vehicle or on a hands-free device. But this auditory distraction reduces it increases our risk of distraction overall and reduces our ability to concentrate on driving. Visual distraction occurs when a driver looks at anything other than the road ahead. We have this in various forms. Some of them aren't that bad, such as checking our rear view mirror or our side mirrors. It keeps us centrally based looking. But we also do have some visual distractions, such as checking on kids in the back of the car, passengers. We might be transporting clients or consumers, and we're checking on them. Or we're looking down at electronic devices, whether it's within the vehicle, such as an informatics system, telematics. For some of our commercial motor vehicle operators, it might be an ELD monitor, or it could be anything like a GPS unit or a cell phone. I came across a nice study, actually, and I thought this summarized very well how both, as we're talking about auditory and visual distractions, work. This study was conducted in 2006. It was published in Investigative Ophthalmology and Visual Sciences of a lab study that was conducted of 28 what they deemed visually normal young adults between the age of 20 and 24 years old. These individuals were put into a driving simulator and introduced both visual and auditory distractions. And then they evaluated what they considered the central and peripheral visions of those drivers for errors. What they realized in the study when they concluded it was that central and peripheral errors increased significantly in the presence of auditory distractors. So as you can see on the graph to the top right there, you can see that when they were introduced no auditory distractors at all, represented in that darker black bar graph, you could see that they had a steady baseline. When they were actively listening, you could see that even without visual distractors, there's a little bit of increase in errors. But once they had to respond to those auditory stimulants, so whether it's responding to a question or they had to acknowledge an auditory sound, you could see that they had a high risk of error even in the central viewing. So that's directly in front of you as you drive. And those even increased more in the peripheral, even when auditory distractors or visual distractors were introduced into there. And what really surprises me about that is that a lot of our controls that we're saying we're putting in place right now might be related to hands-free devices, but that includes active listening for the driver. And the study really represents that that auditory stimulant really does distract us from the task of driving. There was several errors identified just in that forward viewing of these drivers. So even though we consider hand-free devices to be a control for distracted driving, this study really represents that it's not. And when you compound active listening with responding and even having visual distractors, whether that might be anything from an ELD system, a telematics system, a GPS system, that those errors increase significantly, especially in our peripheral vision, where that could be, very important if we have traffic that's coming from the left or the right from us. And lastly, the manual distraction, or last distraction I want to discuss here is manual distraction. And manual distraction is when a driver will physically take one or both hands off the wheel for any sort of reason. This could be due to eating, drinking, adjusting the radio, GPS, trying to get something out of a bag. And again, this could be grabbing a map book if they're still utilizing map books, or looking at paperwork. So that manual distraction is just as significant. So now that we talked about the components of distracted driving, such as distractions being conscious and unconscious, and the 4 different types of distractions from cognitive, auditory, visual, and manual, I also want to talk about the state of mind of the driver, because really a driver's state of mind can also make them vulnerable to distractions. And the types of mindsets that typically do lead to distractions are frustration, complacency, fatigue, and rushing. And this really isn't a surprise because we typically see the same type of mindset creating errors or mistakes in any sort of job task that's performed, whether it's general industry to healthcare, but especially behind the wheel when we have to have 100%, or we'd like to have 100% of our concentration on driving. Any of these mindsets can contribute to distracted driving. So here's that overall picture. So we see here that our state of mind can contribute or lead to us having distractions. So that rushing, that frustration, a lot of what we see as employers is complacency with employees. I've done it this way for X amount of years. I've never had an incident or got injured, so why change it? I'm complacent on how I perform. But all of those different types of mindsets can lead to our types of distractions, such as cognitive, auditory, visual, manual. And then again, is it a conscious or unconscious form of distraction? So quite a few different components that actually go into distracted driving, just versus us saying, oh, it's us taking our mind off of the task of driving. Some common sources of distraction that we do come across, and I'm going to put together my top 10 list here that I typically hear of or have seen from losses, is first and foremost is just that general distraction of being lost in thought. Many times before an incident occurs, people claim that they were lost in thought, they don't know what happened, and this can again be due to be contributed to any of the aspects that we just mentioned. Second is actually cell phone use. Many think that that would be the first, but it's actually second. Cell phone use followed by outside persons, objects, or events. We see this a lot, especially in your metropolitan areas when you have those giant LED billboards that are changing consistently as we're driving. That can, pull that auditory distraction and make us miss maybe stop cars in front of us. Fourth is other occupants. So having that active conversation with other occupants in the vehicle. Fifth is grooming. We've all seen it out there before. Hopefully, we're not performing it, but you've seen those people doing their hair in their car, doing their makeup on their way into work. But those self grooming tasks, those are also distractors from driving. Eating or drinking, adjusting audio or climate controls or additional features as our vehicles continue to get increased electronics within them. Those additional features bring on additional distractions. Looking for client or customer address or paperwork. We typically see this with some of our delivery services or with some of our social services. If they're looking for a client's address or a delivery address, you're grabbing paperwork, maybe looking at a map book, really honing in on the GPS system as you're getting closer to make sure you don't miss that address. So again, another big distraction. Moving objects in the vehicle, that's also another big one. Trying to reach for that pack of gum that maybe fell off to the side and we're trying to grab that. That rolling can of soda that got away from us that we're trying to grab. And then lastly is habit-related distractions, whether you're smoking, vaping, chewing tobacco. Some of those habit-related exposures do definitely lead to distracted driving as well. So what are some of the behaviors that we see with distracted driving? Well, behavior by Webster Dictionary is defined as the way in which someone conducts oneself or behaves. So what is that one behavior that we really know leads to distractions and especially distracted driving? And that is multitasking. So anytime we're doing anything outside of the task of driving, we're multitasking. Again, looking at all those different top 10 sources we just talked about, or I have to be actively involved in a teleconference while I'm driving. Anytime we're multitasking, we're putting strain on our cognitive load and it's going to lead to human error. And as that one study identified in 2006 that we discussed earlier, anytime we even have that auditory response that we have, that stimulate of listening to our manager on the phone while we're driving, and now we have to comprehend what they're saying and come back with a answer for them, that's putting a huge strain on the cognitive load. And again, is proven to show human error in just our vision alone and identifying. So this graph that we have here, this is a nice one that AAA put together on mental distraction levels by task. And we see that really, if we are to just perform the task of driving itself, it's a relatively low distraction. We are going to have some form of distractions, again, looking in the rear view mirror behind us, side mirrors. But again, we're staying within that central view, and it's a relatively low distraction if we're completely dedicated to the task of driving. As soon as we start introducing any outside addition of multitasking, adjusting the radio, the temperature controls, we're starting to push towards that medium distraction level. Most of our vehicles now, whether it's a commercial vehicle to a residential use style vehicle, there's a lot of advancements in how to adjust the radio, temperature controls. We're really trying to be in tune with the driver, but there's still distraction there. As soon as we start listening to messages, we start bumping up into that medium distraction area. And again, as identified in that one study we talked about earlier, when we're listening and composing messages, so now we have to actively listen and respond while driving, we start seeing that we start getting into the high distraction range where it becomes more significant that we're going to have error and your risk for an incident related to distracted driving is greater. Utilizing navigation systems, while they have gotten better, they are still definitely a medium distraction, especially as we start getting closer to the location we want to get to, and we're spending more time looking down at a unit or at a unit. And even some of our what we believe are our biggest controls for distracted driving, such as using Apple Siri that AAA did this study on here, they found that the highest distraction came when people were trying to use Siri or Alexa or any of those uh, platforms where we have to communicate with it, and then maybe we don't get the response we want, so now we spend more time trying to communicate that, such as, Siri, can you find this destination, and it's the wrong destination, and then we have to look at our phone and try to type it in. So again, even though we believe that some of these hand-free devices are actually controls for distracted driving, we see that there's more user error and higher rate of error because of the high distraction that those hand-free units perform or actually supply. So what are the risks of distracted driving? Well, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration did release some information. This was from 2017, I believe, and they had mentioned that we're 23 times more likely to have a risk of a crash if we're driving while texting. And we have some other information coming up here about why that is. But really, a text message takes about a minimum of 5 seconds. And there's a far amount of distance that we can travel within 5 seconds of not looking down at the road. So 23 times more likely to be involved in a crash if we're driving while texting. Dialing a phone number increases your risk by 2.8 times, while reaching for a device increases the risk by 1.4 times. And if you think about it, reaching for a device, maybe a second, two, but again, anytime we deviate from the task of driving, we increase those risks of a potential injury or risk of an accident. Talking or listening to conversations in the car increases the risk by 1.3 times. And again, the more active listening we perform, where we have to actually interpret and respond to that conversation, it's going to increase our distraction and again increase the risk of an accident. So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration conducted a 100 vehicle analysis over an 18-month period of normal daily driving in a metropolitan environment. And this was a really nice study that researched and evaluated driver inattentions and rated it on 4 different categories: driver engagement and secondary tasks, so those tasks not necessary to the primary task of driving; driver drowsiness; driving related inattention to the forward roadway, so not looking forward, looking to the side or doing something else outside of just staring forward while driving; and non-specific eye glances away from the forward roadway. So again, this could be just looking up at the rear view mirrors, side mirrors. We're not putting too much attention outside of our forward-facing view. A few of the primary results were that driving while drowsy increases an individual's near crash or crash risk by 4 to 6 times. Not surprising, as we talked about earlier, that overview of distracted driving, those kind of behaviors will actually increase distracted driving. And here we actually have proof that it can increase it by 4 to 6 times. Engaging in complex secondary tasks increases the risk by 3 times, and engaging in moderate secondary tasks increases the risk by 2 times that of normal baseline driving. So very significant. Here's a nice graph that I was able to find from the National Highway Traffic Safety Association that has the results data to determine the odds ratio of near crash and or crash risk in various secondary tasks over just driving. So we could see reaching for a moving object, they identified with this 100-car study, is the largest odds ratio of having that near crash or crash risk at 8.82%. Insect in a vehicle, surprisingly, number 2, 6.37. But if any of us have ever had an insect in a vehicle, it probably isn't all that surprising. Nobody wants to come face to face with a hornet while you're going 55 miles an hour, or have a spider drop down at you as you're trying to make your way through a busy metropolitan area. So not a lot of surprise there, but definitely a distraction nonetheless. Looking at internal objects brings up 3.7% odds, all the way to reading, applying makeup, and dialing a handheld device. And we could see that the numbers start dropping off as we get away from keeping our eyes away from the road. So we could see that definitely any task that deviates our eyes from the road, in addition to that auditory stimuli, really does increase our risk of injuries or a crash. So we want to make sure that our drivers are aware of these kind of actions and that they're doing everything to prevent them. So again, preparing before we get on our trips, making sure we have all objects within arm's reach, making sure that we don't have those distractions, not applying makeup or self grooming while we're driving. And again, we're going to talk about some of the resources or some of the initiatives we should make on having handheld devices being used within the vehicle and restricting that. So the real danger is really texting and driving, and we keep hearing this more and more. And Virginia Tech did a very nice study in which, as I kind of alluded to earlier, it takes a minimum of about 5 seconds to read a text message. And if we're driving at least 55 miles per hour, drivers can travel the distance of an entire football field without looking at the road. That's pretty scary, considering an entire football game could be played on 100 yards, and that's missing a lot of information to make critical decisions in your driving habits if you're not looking at the road. So these are the real scary numbers, but really we need to even look outside of just cell phones and texting, looking more at our informatics systems that we have in our vehicles, and or looking at for our commercial vehicle drivers, some of our ELDs. How does that interface look with them? Are they glancing down at it? And if they are, if the vehicle's moving or if it's operable while it's moving, at 5, 6, 7 seconds, there's a long duration of time that our drivers aren't looking in front of them. So what are the costs of distracted driving? We've talked about what creates distracted driving, what type of behaviors we see, what types of distractions there are. But now what's the cost? What are we seeing, especially for you guys as employers of fleet? Well, according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, in 2017, 6% of all motor vehicle crashes in the US involved a distracted driver, a substantial number, and that has even increased now over the past couple years, but we don't have any official release from the NHTSA at this time. But in 2017, they saw that just shy of 3,200 people died in crashes involved in distracted driving, and just shy of 600 non-occupants died in crashes that involved a distracted driver. So that's your pedestrians or cyclists, people who aren't even in a motorized vehicle, had passed in 2017 just due to distracted driving alone. The Network for Employers for Traffic Safety, or NETS, in 2015 also did another release of information. And in 2015, they identified that employers had spent $47.4 billion in direct cash-related expenses for MVAs. So that includes medical care, liability, lost productivity, and property damage, a substantial number that employers paid out in 2015 alone. And again, once additional information gets released, I wouldn't doubt that that number might even be higher. On average, a non-fatal injury crash at work that involves distracted drivers cost the employer $72,442, again in 2015. But that's for a non-fatal injury crash. So obviously we know that if there was a fatality, that number can be tripled, if not quadrupled. We're going to discuss in a little bit a guideline for employers to reduce motor vehicle crashes. And this was it's a really nice guideline that was put together by OSHA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and then NETS. But I want to discuss one of the pages. It's page 32 in the document. that discuss the cost of motor vehicle crashes for employers. And the reason I do like this page is it brings to light some of the costs that we do typically think about when it comes to crashes within our fleet, especially if it's distracted driving related. But it also addresses some of the indirect costs that we really don't think about. Some of the direct costs that we would come to, recognize as normal costs with an incident related in our fleet would be your work comp benefits, healthcare costs. It could be the physical or vocational rehab costs, auto insurance, liability claims, and settlements. Those are all areas that we would anticipate if our employee got injured due to a crash. And then again, that general liability that we might have to pay out on that crash as a whole. Some of the indirect costs that we forget to really put into the overall cost of that claim is your supervisor's time to go out and investigate, fleet manager's time to coordinate the vehicle repairs, replacements, reassigning personnel to cover that missing employee's route, region, or delivery, overtime payment that we have to pay people to cover that. That employee may be suspended after the incident, they may be hospitalized, or the worst case scenario, it could lead to a fatality. That really does put those indirect costs at a much higher initiative, just as much as those direct costs for us as employers. So really, there's a lot to consider outside of just saying, "Oh, we had this crash, and it's not bad because we have let's say $25,000 of front damage to our vehicle." But really, we need to look at that indirect cost. That while it's $25,000 of direct costs on repairs to that vehicle, is that employee being suspended? Do we have the indirect costs of pulling other people to cover the zone, overtime? If we end up terminating that employee, the replacement costs of onboarding a new employee or a new hire to take that position. There's a lot more that goes into it. And this one worksheet that they have here is a very nice one. If you do this, even hopefully you don't have to. Hopefully we don't have those incidences in our fleet, but we know that they do happen. And if you use this worksheet and do this just even a couple times, really look at your overall cost that you spend. And then it really puts distracted driving on top of just regular driving in a whole new perspective of how much it really costs you as an employer. And then, of course, we have our irreplaceable costs. So we're talking about dollar amounts, but again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we really want to put some controls on our irreplaceable assets as a company, and that's our employees. And unfortunately, driving as a whole is a dangerous task, but when you add distracted driving on top of it, it becomes an extremely dangerous task. Here are a few examples as to kind of address some of those irreplaceable costs related to distracted driving. So this first one comes from the National Transportation Safety Board, and it was an incident that occurred on March 26, 2010. A semi-trailer was traveling southbound on I-65 near Munfordville, Kentucky. The driver ended up crossing a grass median, entered a northbound lane where it was struck by a 15-passenger van. Very tragic incident. The crash killed 11 people, and the NTSB determined that the probable cause of the crash was the truck driver's failure to maintain control of his vehicle because he was distracted by the use of his cell phone. So an absolutely preventable incident. And this one is on the catastrophic end, that 11 people had catastrophic results because of this incident, because the driver was distracted with the use of his cell phone. Another incident, this incident was not created by an employed or an employee of an employer. It was somebody driving that was distracted, but nonetheless, it involves us as fleet managers or administrators for a fleet account. It shows just the significance of not only our drivers being distracted, but just other drivers on the road. And that's really who I'm most concerned about for you guys, is your fleet being around distracted drivers as well. But this incident was on August 5th, 2010 from Gray Summit, Missouri. As vehicles were merging from the left to right lane, a bobtail tractor slowed behind the merging traffic and was rear-ended by a pickup truck, setting off a chain of fatal collisions. A school bus carrying 23 passengers struck the pickup truck and came to rest on top of the pickup and the bobtail tractor that had struck earlier. Moments later, a second school bus and the convoy that was carrying 31 passengers rear-ended the school bus. 2 people were killed, 38 were injured, most of those being children. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of the first collision was distraction due to text messaging conversation conducted by the pickup driver. And again, it didn't allow him the ability to see that bobtail tractor in front of him slowing due to that merging traffic. So again, an absolutely preventable situation that led to the death of 2 people and 38 injuries. And then I'm going to finish up some of our crash scenarios here with a recommendation change that the NTSB is coming out with a more recent crash that happened on March 23rd, 2018. It was a fatal crash that involved a Tesla Model X belonging to Apple Incorporated in Mountain View, California. During the initial findings, the NTSB identified that the driver was distracted by a mobile phone and relied heavily on the Tesla's autopilot system. Because at the time that the driver was utilizing their mobile phone, they had the autopilot system on, but California was conducting some repairs on the side of I believe it was an exit way, and they had a convoy line that was not identified as being there. So the automated autopilot system for Tesla did not identify this. So it identified that the road was still open. Because the driver was occupied with I believe it was a mobile app video game, the autopilot system slammed into the back of a non-operational crash cushion. And this happened at about 70 miles an hour. Well, the SUV struck 2 other vehicles, resulting in the injury of another person on top of the driver of the Tesla passing. The SUV's high voltage battery was damaged in the collision, and it burst into flames, engulfing the car and endangering first responders. So again, a chain reaction of events that could have been even more significant or more catastrophic based on distracted driving. But the NTSB really recognized this, that we're being too compliant or complacent with some of the technology that we have. And because the driver was in a company car belonging to Apple, the NTSB feels OSHA should take steps to ensure employers have appropriate company vehicle policies in place to make sure that even if we have an autopilot system, that we have policies that still say we have to be alert and that we cannot be distracted while driving, because driving is by just nature a dangerous task. The board said OSHA should both update its guidance for employers on reducing motor vehicle crashes and strictly enforce compliance with the guidelines. So what they want to do is they want to include within those guidelines for employers to reduce motor vehicle crashes, they want to increase employers' awareness to the need to develop strong cell phone policies prohibiting the use of portable electronic devices while driving a company-owned vehicle. So this goes for all of fleet as a whole, not even just our commercial motor vehicle operators, but anytime any of our employees are driving for company business. And really, I think the biggest struggle that we're having as fleet professionals and those that oversee fleet is that as technology advances, so does our potential distractions, and we need to advance our controls. So what are some of our laws that we currently have? We already know that commercial motor vehicle drivers, we have a law that they cannot operate a handheld device while operating a vehicle. But what other laws do we have out there, especially for some of our fleet that are not governed by DOT regs or FMCSA? We know that, we have a lot of strong recommendations, but currently the laws really are not in favor of a overall federal guide or a federal regulation. It's more based on a state law base. So pretty much currently there's no national ban on texting or using a wireless phone while driving, but there are state laws and fines that are becoming more aggressive in the effort. So currently we do have 21 states, including Washington, D.C., that have banned all drivers from handheld phone use while driving. And that includes obviously driving on the job and off the job. That's anytime we drive, period. 48 states and Washington, D.C. have banned texting while driving for all drivers. 39 states and Washington, D.C. have prohibited all cell phone use by novice drivers. So we're going to go over a few of those scenarios, what novice drivers are considered, because each state has their own opinion on what they consider a novice driver. And then 20 states, including DC, have prohibited school bus drivers from cell phone use while driving. But as a CMV, as a commercial motor vehicle operator, we know that they are prohibited from cell phone use at all, texting while driving, period. So for some of our core states that we do write business with, I put together just a quick graph here of some of our core states. But the additional information can be attained from the GHSA, and that web link's listed below here. But in Illinois, we could see that just going across, a handheld ban is for all drivers, cell phone ban for all school bus drivers, and then they quantify novice drivers as under the age of 19. And yes, there is a ban for those as well. When it comes to text messaging, we've seen not just in Illinois, but in all the states listed here that there is a ban for all drivers to not be texting while driving. And that's covered for school bus drivers and novice drivers as well, too. And each one of the states listed does have crash data. So a lot of the states are trying to become more progressive. We could see out of the ones here that Minnesota and Illinois are the only two listed here that have a handheld ban. But states are becoming more aggressive with reducing distracted driving, and that is trying to reduce the amount of handheld devices being used. And again, every state is pretty much getting strict. I think 48, if I remember correctly, on texting while driving. Everyone is trying to reduce that, and fines can be heavy for those. So while there is no national-based or federal-based regulation for handheld devices, texting while driving, there is guidelines. And a document that I mentioned earlier is the Guidelines for Employers to Reduce Motor Vehicle Crashes. So this document it's advisory in nature. It's informational content that is intended to assist employers in providing safe and healthful workplace. A lot of times we may look at our fleet, especially for us who are over-the-road truck drivers, those of us who maybe have commercial motor vehicles and comply with DOT regulations. We think of that as being our only fleet exposure, where these guidelines, they also help for those additional vehicles, those maintenance trucks that are running for supplies, the sales teams vehicles, the pool vehicles that we're maybe using. Those are all part of our fleet exposure as well, too. And some of these guidelines are very nice at putting parameters in place to ensure the safety of the drivers operating any fleet vehicle. So again, this document, the OSHA requires employers to comply with the hazard-specific safety to the health standards. So we're going to discuss a little bit about how OSHA can go about, and while we don't have requirements in place, the general duty clause does fall into place for employers when it comes to distracted driving. But again, this is a nice guidance or a guideline to utilize. So like we said, OSHA focuses to really, as an employer, we want to create work policies and practices that encourage or require workers to not text and drive. So we do not want to use electronics while driving. OSHA is not going to come into your job site and they're not going to say, they're not going to nail you exactly for saying, do you not have this? But if we have tasks that really make workers utilize a electronic device, or you have a fleet of sales reps and somebody calls in and complains to OSHA saying, I have to drive for a living 8 hours a day, I sell product, and my employer requires that I call in while I drive to participate in telephonic conferences and I feel distracted while driving. If we're encouraging our drivers to be distracted while driving, then again, they can look at that general duty clause and say, we are putting an increased risk on our drivers. We're not controlling the exposure, and you could be cited for that. So OSHA is permitted to visit a job site based on worker complaints. So like we were talking about, the sales rep that says, my employer says I have to answer text messages or emails while I'm on the road driving. We don't want that as employers. We want to avoid that by having strict policies to not do so. OSHA can also visit an employer that we just talked about, makes texting a practical necessity for the job. And in these situations, a financial penalty can be issued depending on the severity of the citation. So again, just like anything else, if you're a general manufacturer, we don't want to encourage our employees to get injured by lacking machine guarding issues or to tell them to be distracted while operating a heavy piece of machinery. So really the same rules go into effect when operating a heavy piece of machinery called the vehicle. So we really do want to make sure that we're protecting our employees from distracted driving by strict policies and procedures. So how do we protect our company and our employees from distracted driving? Well, we want to make sure we have a distracted driving prevention program. And really, we're going to break it into 4 steps. Within a distracted driving prevention program, step 1 is to create and implement a distracted driving policy. This is going to set the foundation for the entire prevention program. You want to state your organization's position on the use of phones and electronics while behind the wheel. So again, a zero tolerance for utilizing phones, electronics, for being distracted behind the wheel. It should apply to everyone in your organization who drives a vehicle for company business. So even if we have that one employee that maybe only takes the company vehicle once a year to go get product for the office, if they're driving on company business, they need to know about this policy. So it's anybody driving on company business. Even if that person only drives on company grounds, they have to understand the policy. And if they're even operating their own personal vehicle, but they're being reimbursed for mileage, again, that's company business. They need to know about these policies, this strict policy and this zero tolerance for utilizing handheld devices or being distracted while driving. Step 2 is to communicate this policy. So within the program, we want to discuss the distracted driving prevention program on a regular basis. It should never be a one and done. This is a high risk exposure. We want to make sure we're continually keeping this in front of anyone who would operate a vehicle for company business. Have any and every employee who drives on company business acknowledge and sign off on a policy stating your expectations of them while they operate a vehicle for company business. Um, Also encourage routine emails, newsletters, bulletins, driver trainings, and even signage inside of any of your vehicles to communicate throughout the years. Here's just a quick picture that I put together. Company policy, no electronics in driving. A sticker like this in some of your vehicles, again, just reminds employees, our expectation is that you concentrate on driving. We do not want you utilizing a hands-free device or any other electronics while you're operating a vehicle for company business. Step 3 is you have to comply with your policy and program. The administration and management should always be leading by example. As a fleet manager, an administrator, just a manager overall, a great way of leading by example is if you're calling into a conference call or you happen to get a conference call while you're driving, is to automatically tell everyone on the line, I will have to call you back. I am currently driving. I have to get into a safe location and I will call back. Or make sure that you are parked and in a safe location before taking that call. There's nothing worse than trying to uh, preach something and not practice. So we definitely have to comply with our policies and program. Do not talk, text, message, or email while driving. Do not allow some, but not others. The worst thing to do is, oh, well, our management staff can respond to emails while they're driving, but anyone underneath management cannot. Nope, should be a one size fits all policy. Anybody who operates a vehicle for company business, regardless of the task, follows these policies. Tell people to find a safe place to park and call back. And even if you call an associate and they say, oh, I'm on the road right now, tell them, you know what, that's all right. Why don't you go ahead, find a safe place to park and call me back, or call me back when you can. Don't encourage them to keep talking. Again, practice what you preach and refrain from mandates using electronics while driving. Step 4, enforce, and that's a big aspect too. Managers are in the best position to promote safe driving practices. They're involved with their employees more than even administration is. And let them know what our expected behaviors are and enforce them. Reward those that are following the policy or program. Attaboy for someone who we call them and they say, hey, I'm on the road right now. I'll have to call you back when I'm in a safe location. That's a great opportunity to reward that person. Thank you for following our policies and our program. And it's that kind of behavior that's going to reduce the risk of an injury or an incident or an accident from occurring. And enforce those who are not. If you have that employee that you see leave your lot and they're on their cell phone, they're on their hands free, you see them glancing down to the cell phone, you have to write them up. We have to enforce this policy. This is a very high hazard risk job task, driving as a whole. And again, we have to enforce the safety policies in place. So I wanted to take a few minutes to discuss a sample distracted driving policy. Again, this is not intended, this would not be intended to be verbatim. These are just samples of how you can put together a distracted driving policy or assess your current distracted driving policy and make sure you have best practices in place. Before you implement any sort of distracted driving policy or make changes, make sure you go through all your avenues at your employer, whether that's running it through HR or legal. Again, this is just a sample and suggestion to best practices. So with any policy, we want to have an opening paragraph, an expectation and intention of effective date. So effective as of April 29th today, and then what your opening paragraph of expectations might be. So here would just be a sample. Within the first opening paragraph, state something in regards to, in order to increase employee safety and reduce unnecessary risk behind the wheel. In this situation, I used West Bend has enacted a distracted driving policy effective April 29, 2020. We are committed to stopping distracted driving and have created the following rules. That's when we can then lead into our rules as to what we want to accomplish within our expectations. So list your expectations and restrictions of utilizing handheld electronics, performing tasks outside of driving, and any other additional parameters that you deem unsafe or potentially distracting. So again, a sample would be employees may not use a handheld or hands-free cell phone while operating a vehicle during company business. Again, I really like that term company business because that applies to any vehicle, personal and or company owned, whether they're on premise or not or off premise. But it really puts that foundation that anytime you're operating for company business, this is the expectation. Whether the vehicle's in motion or stopped or at a traffic light, you're restricting the use of hands-free cell phones. This includes answering or making phone calls, engaging in phone conversations, reading or responding to emails, instant messaging, social media, and text messages. Again, you can elaborate even further. If you have a telephonics or a telematics system, you may want to incorporate something along those lines. We don't want you looking at your ELDs while your tractor's in motion. Please refrain from utilizing telematics while the vehicle, or you shall not use telematics while the vehicle's in motion. That you should be looking at it once you're parked. Then what's the application? When does this policy apply? So this policy applies to all employees when any of the following applies. So again, operating a company vehicle, operating a personal vehicle on company basis, driving on company property, Using a cell phone supplied by the company, that's a big one too. And we'll talk about some distracted driving initiatives you can do with company-owned cell phones, and even using a personal cell phone while on company business. So again, setting those parameters so you don't give a lot of gray area for your employees to try to say, well, I didn't understand that I couldn't be on my phone while operating a company vehicle or my own company vehicle while on company time. Then we have our additional parameters. So a sample could be additionally, company employees are required to, and this is where you can really spell out what your expectations are for the use of electronics. So turn off your cell phone, put them away on silent or airplane mode before starting the vehicle. Modify your voicemail greetings to indicate that you are unavailable to answer calls or return messages while driving. That's a great initiative, especially for those of us who are on the road consistently. um, Updating your voicemail or having an auto reply that says, I'm currently on the road and unavailable to talk at this time. Please leave, your name, number, best contact to get a hold of you, and I will call you when I'm at a safe location. Again, it gives that precedence that we take safety as a priority within the organization. Inform your clients, your associates, or your personal contacts that your company has a policy, and that we have explain to them that we will not be taking calls or returning emails while we are on the road. And again, your associates will appreciate that they don't have that pressure that they have to respond to that email, or I feel I have pressure to return that client's call while I'm on the road. Because again, we're spelling out our expectation is that you are not on the phone or utilizing personal devices while operating a vehicle on company time. Address if and when electronics need to be used. So if you do have to use electronics, identify if a company employee needs to use their cell phone, they must pull over to a safe location. I like putting in there the vehicle must be in park prior to utilizing any handheld device. Again, this puts a precedence that sitting at a red light is not a good time to be on your cell phone checking emails, because again, what that could do is that can lead to distraction of looking down. A car honks behind you, it scares the person, they hit the gas, and maybe the car in front of them didn't go either, and that's who the person behind you was honking at. So that can lead to a distracted accident. So again, I think that anytime we use an electronic device, our vehicle should be in park. And then a warning or an enforcement of penalty. Let the associate know or your employees know what will happen if they don't comply to our policy and procedures. So failure to comply with this policy may result in disciplinary actions in compliance with your company's policies if you have a 3-strike process or program in place. But it can lead up to suspension and or even termination of not even just driving privileges, but maybe even employment. And then have your employees sign this policy. Again, this is the foundation of your entire program. This is what you're going to rest your hat on for distracted driving expectations. So all employees that drive for company business should sign on your policy. And even if they don't drive normally for you, but they have the potential to drive, this should be something that's brought up at the time of onboarding and then reviewed routinely. So we want to keep this fresh. And again, we want to keep this in the forefront of all of our drivers' minds on what our expectation is. Some of the advancements that we have had now that obviously we discussed earlier with advancements in electronics and technology comes the increase to distracted driving, and then we have to increase our controls. There are some free mobile apps on the market right now, and I'm not endorsing any of these 3 apps that I have listed on the slide in front of you, but these are some of the more well-perceived, larger mobile apps to help stop distracted driving. So the first one I just want to mention is Lifesaver. You can go to the website provided. This is an app that's good for Android and iOS networks, but Lifesaver blocks cell phone usage while driving. So while the cell phone identifies that it's in motion, it will actually block cell phone usage. It does allow for hands-free calls though, and if you implement your navigation and your music apps before you start moving, those will remain active. But once the vehicle's in motion, you can't get into like your Pandora or any of your other music apps that you might be using, and your Google Maps or your navigation will be shut off until you come to rest. So that's actually a very nice mobile app. It's free, and you can have it downloaded. So if you provide a company telephone, this is an app that you can put on there and mandate that it does stay on. If your employees use their own cell phone, it can just be a recommendation that they use this when they drive. But again, we can't enforce that somebody upload an app such as that. But again, it's not a bad idea to look at those different avenues. The next one is drive mode. Again, you could go to the website there, drivemode.com, or you can look on your marketplaces for Android or iOS networks and look for this app. But once the vehicle hits 15 miles per hour, drive mode kicks on and it silences alerts, phone calls, and texts. What's really nice is drive mode can actually send out auto replies automatically. So you could set up an auto reply to say, I'm currently driving and please, respond with a good contact, or, I will contact you as soon as I get to a safe location and I'm off the road, or whatever you want that message to look like. But that's a really nice service because not only does it block, but it also auto replies. So your clients, your consumers, your boss, your work associates, they understand that you're driving and that you're taking it seriously to not be distracted while driving. And then there's Text Drive. And Text Drive does not have a website. It's an Android only device, or only works on Android platforms. But it's a simple autoresponder, very similar to drive mode, except that it works at any speed. It doesn't just initiate after 15 miles per hour. But again, it's a very nice feature to set up an auto text or a phone call reply with a custom message. And it does even use replying to voice commands. So you can send out, I'm busy, or reject call, and this app will kick in as well too. So a very nice app. Again, all three of these are free, but maybe a nice initiative you can look at, especially if you have company-owned telephones that the employees are utilizing. A paid system on the larger scale, so not just looking at mobile apps, but one of the largest software programs out there for a paid system is Truce. And Truce actually bought out quite a few other software networks that looked at distracted driving. So Truce, as I said, is a paid system, but it allows some administrative controls, and it really allows controls over your vehicles as a whole. So Truce does require devices called a drive tag that would be installed into all your company vehicles. But what's nice about that is it connects you as an administrator to an app, and that app can be on your telephone, your tablet, or you can log into it, and it disables any sort of incoming calls, texts, or other features such as camera, email, or Google usage on any phone that's within the vehicle that it's installed. So now this does take control. If employees using a personal telephone, this will take control of that telephone and pretty much shut it off or put it into an airplane mode while they're in your vehicle. And this can be set that it will enable all features of a phone when the vehicle is in park. You could set it to different parameters. At 0 miles per hour, they can do navigation, but you have complete control. And then you even receive notifications if the device was removed or disabled. So again, you can see what is going on in your fleet in real time. One of the last slides here is a nice resource slide, and this is also a handout that's available to you with this webinar. But some of the documents that we did discuss during this webinar, if you want to get additional information, the first one is the guideline for employers to reduce motor vehicle crashes. This is a very nice guideline set forth if you want to look at assessing your current distracted driving policies, program, or procedures. This is a very nice website that you can go to. You can download the guide. It's about 32 or 33 pages. And it's a really nice insight to making sure you are following best practices. Below that is the CDC's Motor Vehicle Safety at Work. This is a very nice distracted driving website that has a bunch of useful information on how to reduce distracted driving in your fleet exposures. Underneath that is the Governor's Highway Safety Association. We talked about some of those state laws. I brought up a few of our core states there. If you're looking for all 50 states, you could go to the website provided and you could see all the different distracted driving laws that are being enforced within all 50 states. Below that, we have the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's Driver Distraction Program. Again, a large file. I believe this one's about 280 pages, but a very nice document for you to either assess at implementing or addressing your current distracted drivers program and take a look at different parameters to make sure you're meeting best practices. And last but not least, we have the Network for Employers or of Employers for Traffic Safety, their website. And that's a great one for an as employer. There is a ton of useful information on there. Some of their information is free, but to be part of NETS, there is an annual fee, I believe. I don't know what the dollar amount is, but it does open up some additional features and gives you some network opportunity with other fleet exposures. And again, that's something that is stayed up to date on and provides additional useful resources for you. So in summary, distracted driving can be conscious or unconscious. It can be any task that deviates our attention from driving. And it can be for anyone from our commercial motor vehicle operators all the way to our employee who is maybe, driving once or twice a year to get office supplies from Staples. Anytime they're driving for company business, we know that distracted driving is a risk or a hazard. Distracted driving behavior is a multitasking behavior when we're behind the wheel, and we want to reduce that risk of multitasking. There are no federal laws currently. Obviously, we saw that we have recommendations and guidelines in place, and that the states themselves govern those laws. But each state does have their own set of laws and regulations, and we know that OSHA can cite on the general duty clause if we don't have parameters in place to protect our employees. And then again, the big thing is we want to make sure we create and implement a distracted driving program with a formalized policy. And most importantly, walk the talk, enforce that safety program. If you are going to call in, make sure you are parked. Make sure if you get a call from someone, you are in a safe parked location before taking that call, or let them know that you'll have to call them back. Don't be caught by your employees driving around, talking on the cell phone, text messaging. Walk the talk, enforce that safety policy. This part of the presentation, I can allow some questions. If anyone has any specific questions, you can type it in the chat box to the right of the screen. At least for me it is. But you can let me know if you have any specific questions and I would be able to answer them. If you are viewing this after the webinar, maybe this is a viewed recording after the fact, and you happen to have a question, you can contact me directly at jwimmer@wbmi.com for an email, or contact my cell phone at 715-554-3360. And of course, if you have any other questions, you can contact your West Bend Loss Control rep and have them answer that. But I will wait a few minutes and see if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, it was a privilege speaking with you all today about defensive driving, and I hope that you can take some of the considerations from this webinar to enhance your distracted driving policies and overall program. So I don't see any questions coming in at this time. I will go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Again, it was an absolute privilege to speak with you all. I hope that you found this webinar to be informative. And again, please do not hesitate to contact me or your loss control rep if you have any additional questions or concerns based on your distracted driving policies and/or program. That'll conclude today's presentation.